Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that the man you called your husband, the man who held your hand at the altar, the man who kissed your children goodnight, was never truly who he said he was. Imagine discovering that the life he built with you was only half of his story, and that somewhere across town, behind closed doors, beneath a carefully constructed mask of respectability and charm, there was another woman, another family, another world, all of it paid for by the same hands that reach for yours every single morning. Now imagine that when you finally discovered the truth, he didn't apologize. He didn't confess. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he made a decision, a cold, calculated, chilling decision. He decided that you knowing the truth was more dangerous to him than you simply ceasing to exist. And so, with the same hands that once promised to protect you, he began to erase you. This is not a fairy tale. This is not fiction. This is the true story of a man who built an empire of lies so vast, so deeply layered, and so ruthlessly maintained that it took decades, a courtroom, and one woman's relentless refusal to be silenced to finally bring it all crashing down. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was William James Hartwell. To the people of Ashford County, Virginia, in the late 1800s, William was the kind of man that other men aspired to be. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that held just enough mystery to make women look twice, and just enough warmth to make everyone trust him completely. He was the son of a former railroad investor, born into modest comfort, but William had always wanted more than modest. He wanted grandeur. He wanted legacy. He wanted his name carved into something permanent, something that would outlast him and make the generations that followed speak his name with reverence. By the time he was 32 years old, William James Hartwell had done exactly what he set out to do. He had built one of the most prosperous trading companies in the entire state of Virginia, a sprawling commercial operation that dealt in furniture, dry goods, and land leases, the kind of business that made powerful men knock on your door rather than the other way around. He had a mansion on the hill. He had horses in the stable. He had staff who called him sir and meant it. And he had Eleanor. Eleanor Grace Hartwell, born Eleanor Grace Beaumont, was by every measure of the word extraordinary. She had grown up in a genteel family in Richmond, Virginia, the daughter of a judge who believed that a woman's mind was just as worthy of cultivation as a man's. Eleanor had read every book in her father's library twice before she was 18. She spoke French with confidence, played the piano with precision, and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made rooms go still when she entered them. She was not a woman who demanded attention. She simply had it naturally, effortlessly, in the way that truly remarkable people always do. When William Hartwell came courting in the spring of 1871, so he came with flowers and poetry and a persistence that Eleanor's father found charming and Eleanor herself found, after some months of careful consideration, genuinely compelling. They were married in June of that same year. It was the wedding that Ashford County talked about for a decade. The flowers were imported from Charleston. The cake stood 4 tiers high. The guest list read like a directory of Virginia's most influential families. And Eleanor, standing at that altar in a dress that her mother had spent 4 months sewing by hand, looked at William and believed, with her whole heart, that she was stepping into the most beautiful chapter of her life. For the first several years, she was right. William was attentive, generous, and present in the ways that mattered. He came home for supper. He held her hand during church. When their first son, Thomas, was born in the winter of 1873, William wept openly at the bedside, and Eleanor thought she had never loved him more than in that moment. Their second child, a daughter named Clara, arrived 2 years later. The Hartwell household was full of noise and warmth, and the particular kind of chaos that only small children can produce. And Eleanor managed all of it with the grace and steadiness that had always defined her. From the outside, the Hartwells were the picture of prosperity and devotion. Neighbors would point to their home as proof that the right kind of man, paired with the right kind of woman, could build something truly lasting. But Eleanor, even in those early years of contentment, would sometimes catch William staring out a window with an expression she could not quite name. Not sadness, not longing exactly, something more like calculation, as if he were always running numbers that nobody else could see, always weighing something in his mind that he had no intention of sharing with her. What Eleanor did not know, and what would take her the better part of 2 decades to uncover, was that William James Hartwell had been running a calculation since long before he ever proposed to her. He had been running it, in fact, since the age of 26, when he had quietly, without fanfare or announcement, married another woman. Her name was Ruth Elaine Colder. She was a seamstress from a small town called Maplewood, just 40 miles outside of Ashford County, a distance that, in those days before the telephone and the automobile, might as well have been a continent. Ruth was not from money. She had no connections, no influential father, no family name that opened doors. But she was kind in the way that plain, honest people are kind. And William had loved her first, in whatever way William Hartwell was capable of loving anyone. The problem, as William had come to understand it, was that Ruth could not give him the life he wanted. She could not open the doors that needed to be opened. She could not sit at a dinner table with a state senator and hold the conversation together. She could not be the wife that his ambitions required, and so William Hartwell did what men of a particular kind of cowardice have done throughout history. He simply stopped acknowledging that Ruth existed. He moved 40 miles in the other direction and started again. He did not divorce her. That would have required paperwork, public records, the possibility of questions. He simply left her in Maplewood with the understanding, never spoken aloud, that she was to remain invisible. And because Ruth Elaine Colder was a woman of the 1860s with no money, no legal recourse, and no one powerful enough to advocate for her, invisible is precisely what she remained. For years, for more than a decade, William Hartwell lived 2 entirely separate lives with the kind of systematic precision that bordered on the terrifying. On one side of the county, he was the distinguished Mr. William Hartwell, husband of Eleanor, father of Thomas and Clara, pillar of Ashford County society. On the other side, in a small house that he visited under the pretense of business trips and overnight negotiations, he was simply William, the man who had abandoned Ruth Colder and left her to raise their one child, a boy named Samuel, entirely on her own. He sent money occasionally, not enough, just enough to ensure her silence. The question that would haunt every person who later learned this story was not simply how he did it. The question was how no one noticed. And the answer to that question tells you something deeply important about power. William Hartwell had power, not just the power of money, though he had that. He had the power of reputation. And in small-town Virginia in the latter half of the 19th century, a man's reputation was his armor. Nobody questioned William Hartwell because nobody wanted to. He was the man who funded the new church roof. He was the man who gave loans to farmers when the bank turned them away. He was the man whose word everyone agreed was as good as a signed contract. When you build yourself into that kind of indispensability, the people around you develop a vested interest in your virtue. To question William would have been to question the church roof, the farmers' loans, the entire comfortable architecture of trust that the community had built around him. And so, nobody did. Not for years. Not until Eleanor began to notice things she could not explain. It started with small inconsistencies, a business trip that lasted 3 days when she had expected 2. A letter that arrived at the house addressed to a name she did not recognize, in a handwriting she had never seen. A conversation William had in low tones with his foreman that stopped abruptly the moment Eleanor entered the room. Individually, each of these things meant nothing. Collectively, over months of quiet accumulation, they began to form a shape that Eleanor did not yet have a name for. She was not a suspicious woman by nature. She had never been the kind of wife who searched pockets or listened at doors. But she was an intelligent woman, and intelligence eventually will not let you ignore what it sees. In the spring of 1888, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She decided to follow him. She did not do it dramatically. She did not hire a private investigator or confront him at the breakfast table. She simply arranged quietly for her sister to look after Thomas and Clara for 3 days, told William she was visiting her ailing aunt in Charlottesville, and then turned her carriage not north toward Charlottesville but east toward Maplewood. She had nothing concrete to go on. Yet only a town name she had once seen on an envelope that William had taken from her hands a little too quickly. Only a feeling. Only that look she had seen on his face for 17 years. That calculating, closed-off, window-staring look that told her William Hartwell was always keeping score on a board she was never allowed to see. What she found in Maplewood was a small house on a quiet street, and on the porch of that house, hanging laundry in the afternoon light, was Ruth Elaine Colder. And playing in the yard beside her was a boy of about 15 who had William Hartwell's eyes. Eleanor sat in her carriage for a long time before she moved. She would later tell her sister that the strangest part was not the shock, it was the stillness. She said she felt something leave her body in that moment, some essential warmth, some foundational belief in the safety of the world, and in its place came a cold and absolute clarity. She was looking at the truth of her marriage, not a truth that had come recently, a truth that had been there from the very beginning, older than her wedding dress, older than Thomas, older than Clara, older even than the church roof that William had funded and the community had praised him for. She had been deceived not once, but continuously, every single day for 17 years, and she had to decide what to do with that. What Eleanor Grace Hartwell did next is the part of this story that separates her from every other woman who might have found herself in that same carriage on that same afternoon. Most women in 1888 in her position would have gone home. They would have absorbed the blow in private, restructured their understanding of their marriage around this new and devastating knowledge, and continued on because there was no other socially acceptable option. Divorce was scandal. Scandal was ruin. And ruin, for a woman in that era, was not a metaphor. It was a literal reduction of your life to nothing. Eleanor knew all of this. She had grown up in a judge's house. She understood the law better than most women of her time, and she understood precisely how little of it was designed to protect her. And she went home anyway, not because she intended to stay silent, but because she intended to be prepared. For the next 6 months, Eleanor Hartwell moved through her life with the performance of a woman who knew nothing. She was pleasant at supper. She was gracious at social functions. She sat beside William in the church pew and sang hymns and smiled at the neighbors who pointed to them as the ideal of a successful marriage. And all the while she was building a case. She wrote letters carefully to people she trusted, documenting dates and inconsistencies. She made discreet inquiries about the legal records in Maplewood County. She located the record of William's first marriage to Ruth Elaine Colder, dated 6 years before his marriage to her, and she had a trusted clerk make her a copy. She was methodical. She was patient. She was, in the truest sense of the word, determined. And when she finally had everything she needed, when the documentation was complete and the witnesses she had quietly identified were prepared to speak, Eleanor sat down across from William at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in October of 1889, placed the marriage certificate in front of him, and said nothing. She simply waited. The silence that followed was, by Eleanor's own later account, the most revealing moment of her marriage. Not because William broke down, not because he apologized, but because his first instinct, the very first thing that moved across his face in the fraction of a second before he composed himself, was not guilt. It was calculation. He looked at the document the way a chess player looks at the board when a piece has been moved unexpectedly. He was already working out his response, already measuring the threat, already deciding what version of events would best serve his interests. He told her it was a misunderstanding. He told her the marriage to Ruth had been annulled years ago, and the records had never been properly updated. He told her she had been given fraudulent documentation by someone who wished him ill. He was smooth and steady and utterly convincing, and Eleanor sat across from him and nodded slowly and said she understood, and they both knew she did not believe a single word. That evening, William James Hartwell began to understand that Eleanor was not going to quietly disappear from the narrative he had so carefully constructed. And a man who had spent 2 decades building a lie does not simply allow the truth to surface without a fight. Over the weeks that followed, things in the Hartwell household began to shift in ways that were subtle enough to be deniable, but unmistakable enough to be felt. So Eleanor found that her access to the household accounts had been quietly removed. Letters she sent began to go unanswered in ways that made her wonder if they were being delivered at all. On 2 separate occasions, she arrived at social engagements to find that her invitation had apparently been rescinded. The hostess apologetic but vague about the reasons. William was dismantling her credibility before she could use it. He was doing what men of influence in that era did when a woman threatened to expose them. He was making her seem unstable. He was engineering her isolation. But William Hartwell had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed, the way powerful men often assume, that isolation and credibility could be manufactured faster than truth could travel. He had not accounted for Eleanor's sister, Margaret Beaumont, who was not impressed by William's standing in Ashford County and had never been entirely convinced by his charm. He had not accounted for the Maplewood clerk who had copied the marriage certificate and kept his own record of the transaction out of an instinct he could not entirely explain. And he had not accounted for Ruth Elaine herself, who had spent 15 years in a small house in Maplewood, watching William Hartwell prosper on the other side of a lie she had been coerced into maintaining, and who, when Eleanor's carefully composed letter finally reached her hands, read it twice, sat quietly for a very long time, and then wrote back. The letter Ruth sent to Eleanor is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from this story. It has been referenced in county historical records and in the accounts of the legal proceedings that followed. Ruth wrote plainly and without self-pity. She confirmed the marriage. She confirmed the child. She confirmed the years of silence maintained under the quiet pressure of financial dependence and the implicit threat of what would happen to her reputation if she spoke. And then she said something that Eleanor would later read aloud in court. She wrote that she had been waiting, though she had not known she was waiting, for someone to ask her the truth, that she had kept the truth alive in herself the way you keep a candle burning in a locked room, not because anyone was coming, but because it felt wrong to let it go out. Eleanor read that letter and wept for the first time since she had found the house in Maplewood. Not for herself, for Ruth, for the candle in the locked room, for every year it had burned unseen. The legal proceedings that followed were not swift, and they were not clean. William Hartwell was a man with resources, and William Hartwell used every one of them. He retained 3 separate attorneys. He called into question the validity of the Maplewood marriage record on technical procedural grounds. He produced witnesses of his own, men of standing, whose willingness to testify on his behalf was explained to anyone paying careful attention by the loans he had extended them or the business he had sent their way. He attempted to have Eleanor declared mentally unfit, submitting to the court the testimony of a physician who had, conveniently, never actually examined her. He delayed, he appealed, he maneuvered, and through all of it, when Eleanor stood in that courtroom and was steady in the way that only people who have already survived the worst of it can be steady, because the worst for Eleanor had not been the discovery in Maplewood. The worst had been the Tuesday morning at the breakfast table when she watched the man she had loved for 17 years look at the truth and calculate how to destroy it. The case became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Ashford County's history. By the time it came to its full conclusion in the courts, it had lasted the better part of 3 years. Newspapers covered it with the breathless enthusiasm of a readership that had been primed by decades of sensation-hungry tabloid culture to devour exactly this kind of story. A wealthy man, a secret wife, a decades-long deception. As the public appetite for it was enormous and immediate. People who had never met William Hartwell had opinions about him. People who had never been to Ashford County could describe the layout of the Hartwell mansion from newspaper illustrations. Ruth Elaine, who had lived 40 miles away in invisible silence for 15 years, became overnight one of the most discussed women in the state of Virginia. And Eleanor, who had sat in that carriage outside a house in Maplewood and felt something cold and clear replace the warmth she had built her life upon, became something else entirely. She became the woman who had not gone home, the woman who had taken 6 months to build a case instead of a lifetime to carry a secret, the woman who had looked at a locked room and decided the candle inside deserved to be seen. What the court ultimately established was this. William James Hartwell had entered into marriage with Eleanor Grace Beaumont in full knowledge that his prior marriage to Ruth Elaine had never been legally dissolved. The marriage to Eleanor was therefore void from its inception. The children, Thomas and Clara, bore legal complications that took additional proceedings to resolve. The Hartwell business holdings were subject to claims from Ruth's son Samuel, whose legitimacy as William's firstborn was now a matter of established record rather than buried rumor. William's carefully constructed empire, the trading company, the land leases, the reputation, the church roof, all of it sat suddenly in a very different light. Not just the light of scandal, but the light of fraud, a word that carries, in legal terms, any consequences considerably more serious than simple dishonesty. William Hartwell spent the last years of his life entangled in litigation that consumed the majority of what he had spent decades accumulating. He died in 1897, having never publicly admitted to a single deliberate wrongdoing. To the end, the version of events he maintained was one of paperwork errors and misunderstandings, and the unfortunate machinations of people who wished him harm. Eleanor lived until 1921. After the proceedings concluded, she rebuilt her life with the same deliberate steadiness she had brought to every other thing she had ever done. She moved to Richmond, where her name was known, but her circumstances were sufficiently removed from Ashford County that she could construct something new without the weight of the old story pressing down on every interaction. She never remarried. She raised Thomas and Clara with an honesty about the past that was, for the era, remarkable. She told them the truth when they were old enough to hold it. Not a softened version, not a version designed to protect William's memory, but the actual truth, plainly told, so that they would know exactly what had happened and be free to decide for themselves how to carry it. She corresponded with Ruth Colder until the end of her life. The two women who had been placed in opposition to each other by a man who counted on their separation as a condition of his survival became, over the years, something that resists easy categorization. Not friends exactly, not family, something quieter and more particular. Two women who had been deceived by the same lie and had chosen, each in her own way, to be defined not by the deception, but by what they did once they knew the truth. There is a question that lingers over this story, the way certain questions always do, when you strip away the legal language and the newspaper headlines and the courtroom drama, and sit with what actually happened between real people in real rooms over the course of real years. The question is not whether William Hartwell was a bad man. That much is settled. The question is what made it possible. What created the conditions in which a man could sustain a deception of that scale for that long, with that many people in proximity to the truth, and still have it hold together? And the answer, if you look at it honestly, is not William Hartwell's particular cunning. Cunning of that kind is not rare. The answer is the architecture around him. The architecture of a society that gave men of means the benefit of every doubt, that made women legally and financially dependent on the very people most likely to deceive them, that built reputation into a kind of currency that the wealthy could spend to purchase silence and call it respect. William Hartwell was the product of a system that made his lie not just possible, but structurally supported. And Eleanor and Ruth were the product of the same system, which is precisely why dismantling it required not just their courage, but their absolute refusal to accept that the system's verdict on them was final. So, Ruth Elaine Colder died in 1903 in Maplewood, in the same small house where Eleanor had found her hanging laundry in the afternoon light. Her son Samuel had by then established a modest but stable life of his own, independent of the Hartwell name and the legal complications attached to it. He built his life on different ground entirely. The records show he became a school teacher. He taught in Maplewood for 30 years. His students described him, by all accounts, as a man of exceptional patience and uncommon fairness. And if he carried the weight of his origins with him into that schoolroom every day, He appears to have converted it into something that served the children in his care rather than burdening them with it. That too is a kind of courage. The quiet, daily, unannounced kind that does not make newspapers or court records, but matters enormously to the people who receive it. This story has been told in pieces in the historical records of Ashford County and in the broader scholarship of Victorian-era legal cases involving bigamy and property fraud. But what the historical record rarely captures is the texture of what it actually cost. The years that Eleanor spent performing normalcy while building her case. The years that Ruth spent maintaining an invisibility that had been imposed on her rather than chosen. The years that Samuel spent as a secret, a fact that existed only in his mother's knowledge and his father's careful avoidance. History has a tendency to fast forward to the verdict and skip the waiting. And the waiting in a story like this one is where most of the damage is done. It is done quietly in ordinary rooms by the ordinary human need to be acknowledged as real, to have your truth taken seriously, to not be erased by someone else's convenience. William Hartwell's lie was not just a legal offense. It was, for the people most directly affected by it, a sustained and systematic denial of their right to exist as full people in their own story. What would you have done if you were Eleanor? Sitting in that carriage outside the house in Maplewood, looking at a boy in the yard with your husband's eyes, feeling the warmth leave your body and the cold clarity arrive in its place. Would you have gone home and stayed quiet? Would you have confronted William that same evening and accepted whatever explanation he offered? Or would you have sat with that cold clarity, let it settle into something usable, and then turned the carriage around and started building? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this story moved you the way we believe it will, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the stories that survive are the ones that keep being told. And the stories worth telling are the ones that refuse to let the lie have the final word. Subscribe to Hidden Crown Stories, because the stories we bring you are not just about the past. They are about the parts of the past that are still alive in us, still asking to be seen, still waiting, like a candle in a locked room, for someone to finally come in.